Amid the extravagant dinner, a sharp scream tore through the air. "Don't eat that!" A young black boy bolted forward, knocking the plate of food out of the billionaire's hand. The clatter of fine china shattered the elegant silence, and in an instant, outrage erupted. Guests in designer suits and glittering gowns turned their scornful gazes toward the boy, eyes filled with shock and annoyance. But just seconds later, their expressions shifted, first to disbelief, then to horror. The food had been poisoned. And the scariest part? The mastermind behind it could be sitting right there in the restaurant, watching with a cold, calculating smile. Nestled in the heart of the city, Regency Bistro was a hidden gem, a place where only the elite dined. Behind its pristine white tablecloths and flickering candlelight, business empires were discussed, markets were shaped, and fortunes were made or lost over a single meal. At the most prestigious table sat Donovan Hayes, one of the most powerful real estate moguls in America. Across from him, his wife, Celeste Hayes, gazed absently at her phone, her delicate fingers idly twirling a diamond bracelet. At 72, Donovan still carried the air of a man who once controlled billion-dollar deals with a mere nod. His graying hair was neatly combed, his navy blue suit tailored to perfection, and a Rolex shimmered on his wrist, a quiet but undeniable symbol of power. Yet, beneath his sharp eyes, there was a weariness, a weight that even immense wealth could not erase. Celeste, nearly 30 years his junior, was his complete opposite. Her porcelain skin was flawless, her jet-black hair cascading down her shoulders like silk. Clad in a deep red dress that hugged her figure with precision, she looked like she belonged on the cover of a high-fashion magazine. But despite her beauty, there was an emptiness in her gaze. She barely acknowledged her husband, her focus remaining on the glow of her phone screen. Donovan watched her carefully from behind gold-rimmed glasses. What is she thinking? He wondered. Despite being married for 7 years, he had never truly understood this woman. As if sensing his thoughts, Celeste looked up. Her red lips curled into a flawless but chillingly empty smile before she returned to whatever had captivated her on her screen. Donovan sighed. He wasn't young anymore. And perhaps Celeste knew that better than anyone. Outside the restaurant, Elijah Brooks leaned against a streetlight, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He was waiting for the bus after school, but his sharp eyes weren't on the road, they were on the people inside Regency Bistro. At 14, Elijah already carried himself with the discipline of someone far beyond his years. His crisp, white school uniform was immaculate, his striped blue tie perfectly in place. He had his father to thank for that. Colonel James Brooks, a decorated Navy SEAL team leader, had raised Elijah with the values of responsibility, honor, and courage. Observing his surroundings, noticing the details others missed, those were second nature to Elijah. And right now, something inside that restaurant didn't feel right. Through the large glass windows, he saw the polished elegance of Regency Bistro, the flickering golden light, the laughter of the wealthy. But beyond the glitz and glamour, Elijah noticed something odd. At the finest table, Celeste Hayes leaned in toward her husband. It was a graceful, practiced motion, one that seemed natural. But Elijah's instincts screamed otherwise. He narrowed his eyes. Celeste wasn't reaching out in affection. Instead, her hand slipped into the designer handbag beside her. Her movements were precise, practiced, almost too smooth. Then, in a single fluid motion, she pulled out a tiny clear bottle containing a colorless liquid. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. She twisted the cap open, her long fingers moving with unnerving precision. Then, with the elegance of someone who had done this before, she poured the liquid into Donovan's soup. The silver spoon in Donovan's hand hadn't yet touched his lips. But in just one more second, it would. Elijah froze. His heart pounded in his chest, his father's words echoing in his mind. When you see something wrong, you have a responsibility to act. Doing nothing is a choice, but it's always the worst one. This wasn't some schoolyard fight. This wasn't a case of cheating on a test or a minor wrongdoing. This was murder. His hands clenched into fists. What should I do? Donovan was lifting the spoon. The restaurant remained blissfully unaware. Waiters carried silver trays. Guests continued their conversations. Celeste still wore the same unreadable smile. No one saw. No one except Elijah. A single second remained. And that was when he ran. Elijah felt every heartbeat pounding like a drum in his chest, a suffocating sensation creeping through his veins. His father, Colonel James Brooks, had drilled a lesson into him since he was young. When you see something wrong, you have a responsibility to act. Doing nothing is a choice, but it is always the worst one. But this wasn't schoolbullying. This wasn't cheating on a test. This wasn't someone forgetting to pay at a store. This was murder. Elijah swallowed hard, his hands gripping so tightly that his knuckles turned white. What should he do? Inside Regency Bistro, Celeste Hayes still wore her perfect, composed. The atmosphere remained undisturbed, elegant, refined. Guests continued their conversations, silverware clinked against fine china, and servers floated from table to table with practiced grace. No one noticed. No one but Elijah saw the death that had just been dropped into Donovan Hayes' soup. He had no proof. He wasn't an adult, he had no reason to intervene. But Donovan was lifting the spoon. Time seemed to slow. Elijah watched every movement in painstaking detail. Donovan stirring the spoon, raising it, blowing on it lightly. One more second. No. Elijah lunged toward the restaurant door, his arms shooting out instinctively, his pulse roaring in his ears. His mouth opened before his mind could even process the action. Don't eat that. The entire restaurant froze. It was as if Elijah's voice had torn a hole through the refined, elegant atmosphere. The joyful conversations halted. The delicate clinking of silverware against porcelain stopped. The rhythmic flipping of menus ceased. It was as if someone had pressed pause on the world. All eyes turned to the 14-year-old boy standing in the doorway, breathless, his hands clenched into fists. His wide, terrified eyes darted between the diners, but his resolve didn't waver. He couldn't stand still and watch someone walk willingly into their own death. At the center of it all, Donovan Hayes remained frozen. The silver spoon hovered in the air, just inches from his lips. His expression was one of confusion, his sharp, seasoned businessman's mind trying to process the absurdity of the situation. Across from him, Celeste Hayes suddenly stilled. The flawless mask she wore, the elegant, composed beauty, cracked just slightly. Her expression flickered from shock to discomfort, then to something far more dangerous. A brief, calculating glint flashed in her eyes. She wasn't angry. She wasn't panicked. She was thinking. Slowly, she set her glass of wine down with practiced ease, tilting her head slightly as she turned to face Elijah. Like a queen gazing upon an insect that had just ruined her meal. Her voice was smooth, icy, but there was a sharp edge of irritation beneath it. What the hell do you think you're doing? Elijah's throat was dry, but he forced himself to speak. He can't eat that. His voice trembled slightly, but his determination did not. I saw you put something in his soup. A ripple of whispers spread through the restaurant like a wave rolling across the ocean. At first, the guests were just curious. A schoolboy storming into an elite restaurant was strange enough. But then, their expressions shifted as they processed his words. A poisoned soup. They began to glance at each other. Suspicion crept into their voices. At the table, Donovan blinked, his face etched with confusion. What are you talking about? His deep voice carried a weight of authority. Put what in the soup? Celeste Hayes blinked. Then, she suddenly let out a sharp, mocking laugh. The sound was cold, calculated. She shook her head, eyes shifting toward the guests who were now murmuring amongst themselves. This is absurd, she said smoothly, her voice carrying an air of amusement. Then she turned to Donovan, her gaze softening just slightly. This boy doesn't even know us, Donovan. Are you really gonna let some street kid ruin your meal? A clever move. A subtle, powerful blow to Donovan's ego. The rich and powerful did not like being humiliated, especially in public, and if there was one thing they despised more than anything, it was being made to look weak. Elijah felt his chest tighten. He wasn't a street kid. His father was a respected Navy SEAL who had spent his life protecting the country. He had been raised with discipline, courage, and integrity. But to a room full of high society, he was just a nobody, a troublemaker, a boy who didn't belong. But no, he couldn't let that stop him. He squared his shoulders, steadied his voice, and met Celeste's gaze with unwavering determination. I'm not a street kid, Elijah said clearly, rejecting her attempt to discredit him. And I saw you do it. I saw you take out a bottle. I saw you pour something into that bowl of soup. A few guests gasped. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others leaned in closer, their curiosity turning into real concern. Donovan set his spoon down, his sharp brown eyes narrowing as he turned to face his wife. But this time he wasn't looking at her with admiration. He was looking at her the same way he looked at a business deal that didn't add up. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer gentle. "Celeste." His tone was quiet. "Femme, what is this boy talking about?" A single sentence. But the way Celeste's fingers tightened ever so slightly against the table, clenching just for a second before relaxing again, was enough for Elijah to see. She felt the pressure building, and for the first time she didn't have complete control of the situation. But Elijah knew one thing. He wasn't backing down now. Celeste knew this was the pivotal moment. She either maintained control, or she would be exposed. She turned to Donovan, her voice dripping with indignation, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around the stem of her wineglass. "Donovan, are you serious?" she asked, her tone carrying the weight of an offended wife. "You really think your wife, could do something like that?" A familiar tactic. A beautiful, high-status woman, flawless in appearance, untouchable in demeanor, couldn't possibly be the villain. Could she? But Celeste didn't realize one thing. Donovan Hayes wasn't a fool. The air in Regency Bistro stretched tight, like a bowstring pulled to its limit. Elijah stood still, his fists clenched, his breath steady, his eyes unwavering. Would Donovan believe him? That part was out of his control. But one thing was certain, he couldn't back down now. Donovan slowly bit his lower lip, his mind working through the puzzle laid before him. Then, without a word, he reached for the bowl of soup again. But this time, he wasn't going to eat it. He lifted the bowl, bringing it closer to his nose. Celeste froze. It was only a second, a fleeting, nearly imperceptible reaction. But Elijah saw it, and more importantly, Donovan saw it too. He narrowed his eyes, his voice low, steady, dangerous. "Why are you so tense, Celeste?" She blinked, then forced a smile. A perfect mask, but now it had a few cracks. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed, shaking her head. "A random kid bursts in here and claims I'm trying to kill you? Who wouldn't find that absurd?" But there was something in her voice, a tension that only someone perceptive would notice. Donovan placed the soup bowl back onto the table. He had no intention of tasting it now. The restaurant remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of doubt. For the first time, the guests weren't just looking at Elijah. They were watching Celeste, waiting, judging. Was the stunning wife of one of America's wealthiest men hiding a deadly secret? Elijah swallowed hard. He had done something important. He had stopped Donovan from eating the soup. But this battle wasn't over. Not yet. Taking a deep breath, he spoke again. But this time, his voice was clearer. Stronger. "I saw her put something in his soup." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Donovan's sharp brown eyes squinted slightly. A businessman's eyes. The eyes of a man calculating risk. He had made a fortune trusting his instincts, and right now, his instincts were screaming. Is that true, Celeste?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Celeste laughed. A short, sarcastic chuckle, the kind that usually made people doubt themselves. How ridiculous. She shook her head, casting a quick glance at the diners. A high school kid thinks he can accuse me? But even as she laughed, her eyes told a different story. A flicker of unease. A moment of hesitation. And that was all Donovan needed to see. He crossed his arms. It was a simple movement, but one he always did when he suspected someone was lying. "This boy seems very certain, Celeste." Her smile hardened, her voice carrying a slight edge now. "Certain?" she scoffed, voice laced with irritation. "Donovan, are you seriously listening to a kid? He talks like he's some kind of detective." She turned to Elijah, her gaze suddenly colder, sharper. A predator assessing a threat. "Kid," she said, voice smooth but laced with poison. "Do you even know who I am?" Elijah's stomach twisted, but he didn't lower his gaze. "I don't care who you are." His voice was steady. "I only care about what I saw." Celeste stilled. She hadn't expected this. A 14-year-old shouldn't be this fearless. She had expected hesitation. Fear. A weakness to exploit. But Elijah wasn't backing down. And for the first time in her life, Celeste Hayes felt cornered. A smart villain never loses control. Celeste knew that. She forced her shoulders to relax, tilting her head slightly, as if this entire confrontation was nothing more than an amusing joke. With a soft, almost condescending smile, she turned to Elijah. "Oh, really, kid? So tell me, what exactly do you think I put in there?" Elijah hesitated. He didn't know. He had no way to tell what kind of poison it was. No idea if it had a smell. No scientific proof that the soup had been laced with anything. All he had was his own eyes, the eyes that had witnessed what she had done. And Celeste had caught on to that weakness immediately. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering into something smoother, softer, almost comforting. "You don't know, do you?" She let the words settle. "You just saw me do something, and now you think you know everything." A few light chuckles rippled through the surrounding tables. Some guests exchanged glances, their initial concern wavering. Maybe the kid was mistaken. Maybe this really wasn't what it seemed. Elijah felt the weight of it pressing down on him. She was turning the tables. But before he could respond, Donovan suddenly interrupted. His voice was colder than before. "You seem very good at dodging the issue, Celeste." Celeste's gaze flicked toward him, her mask of amusement slipping just slightly. "I'll ask again," Donovan continued, his tone sharper now. "Did you, or did you not, put something in my soup?" For the first time, Celeste hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second, but her fingers clenched against the tablecloth. A tiny reaction, almost unnoticeable, almost. But Donovan noticed it, and so did Elijah. A silence stretched between them. Then Celeste's eyes flashed with something cold, and she suddenly lifted her hand, signaling a nearby waiter. Her voice changed, no longer playful, no longer amused. It was sharp, controlled, dangerous. "I've said too much." She waved dismissively toward the bowl of soup. "Bring me a new one. This one's cold." A diversion. A classic power move, shifting the attention, moving the conversation away from the accusation before it could take root. But Donovan wasn't a fool. He knew exactly how criminals acted when they were cornered. Across the table, Elijah clenched his fists. She was trying to shift the focus, trying to make the situation dissolve into nothing. But he wouldn't let it go silent. His voice cut through the restaurant like thunder. "If you didn't do anything wrong, then eat the soup." The entire bistro fell into a deadly silence. All eyes turned toward Celeste. Donovan squinted. Celeste hesitated for just a second. Then she let out a soft laugh, but this time there was no joy in it. How childish. She rolled her eyes, but she didn't touch the soup. And that was all Donovan needed to see. The weight of the moment hung over the room. Steam still rose from the untouched bowl. Yet no one dared to move. The battle had begun. Elijah's heart pounded, but he stood firm. He had spoken the truth, and he wouldn't let it be buried just because someone more powerful was trying to control the narrative. He took a slow breath, locking eyes with Celeste. Then his voice dropped to a steady, unshakable tone. "If you have nothing to hide, let someone test the soup." Simple, logical, and it landed like a blade slicing through the air. Celeste's hands tightened. For the first time, a flicker of real impatience crossed her cold gaze. She knew the longer this went on, the more dangerous it became for her. But panic was not an option. An angry outburst would only make her look even more guilty. She forced a controlled breath, furrowed her brow slightly, and crossed her arms in front of her chest, regaining her usual poise. Then she spoke, her voice calculated and precise. "You have no proof." She let that linger for a second before delivering her next blow. "Who would believe a street kid over me?" A deliberate move. Elijah stiffened. The entire restaurant seemed to pause for a moment, as if those words had yanked everyone back into the reality of status and class. He wasn't a street kid, but in the eyes of these people, he wasn't one of them. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't connected, he was an outsider, a nobody. For the first time, some of the diners hesitated, their gazes shifting slightly, their earlier concerns starting to crumble. Elijah swallowed back his frustration. He wouldn't let himself be swayed. His voice came out steady. "I don't need to be someone." He took a step forward. "I just need to be the one who saw you do it." Across the table, Donovan's hand tightened around his spoon. He had spent his entire life navigating deals worth millions. He had been exploited by those seeking wealth. He had been used by those who wore fake smiles. But he had never faced something like this. A random teenager with nothing to gain, standing against his own wife in front of a room full of people, and he wasn't backing down. Donovan turned to Celeste, his sharp gaze now carrying something new. Doubt. Real doubt. His voice was slower this time, heavier. "Celeste." A pause. "Can you explain why this boy is saying these things?" Celeste laughed, a short, forced laugh. She shook her head, but this time the motion wasn't as smooth. "Donovan, I can't believe you're doubting me over a child's words." Her voice still carried an edge of confidence, but her hand, the one resting on the chair, was gripping the armrest, tightly. It was a small sign of worry, a detail most would miss, but Donovan saw it. And so did Elijah. A murmur spread across the bistro. The question whispered at every table. Why won't she just let them check the soup? And for the first time, Celeste had no answer. If she's really innocent, why is she so tense? A middle-aged woman, draped in an expensive fur coat, leaned toward the man beside her, whispering in hushed disbelief. "She looks terrified." Celeste felt the words, even if she didn't hear them. Her control, her power, was slipping through her fingers like sand. She couldn't allow this to go any further. No, she wouldn't allow it. Suddenly, she stood up. The movement was sharp, abrupt, completely unlike the effortless grace she usually carried. Both hands slammed onto the table, her nails digging into the polished wood, her icy blue eyes locked onto Elijah like a predator sizing up its prey. Her voice, sharp as a blade, cut through the air. "I've been patient with you long enough." The room fell silent again. Every guest, every server, every set of eyes was now glued to the unfolding confrontation. "Do you really think you can barge in here, make up some ridiculous story, and have everyone believe you?" Celeste's voice was cold, laced with contempt. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" A classic power move, crushing the opponent with status and intimidation. If she couldn't discredit Elijah's accusation, she would discredit him. But Elijah didn't flinch. He held his ground. His voice was steady, unshaken. "I'm not making things up." His gaze flickered toward Donovan, watching, waiting, hoping. "You know that." And then softer, but even more piercing. "And he's starting to know it." Celeste's spine stiffened. For the first time she felt it, the shift. She turned toward her husband. Donovan was watching her differently now. Not with trust, not with admiration, but with suspicion. No, 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 no. She couldn't let this happen. Celeste exhaled sharply, then suddenly laughed, a short, mocking sound, shaking her head as if Elijah's words were nothing but the ramblings of a foolish child. How pathetic. She turned to Donovan, her expression softening into one of pity, as though she were speaking to a naive man caught in a cruel joke. "Are you really going to let some strange kid question the wife who has been by your side all these years?" A direct hit to his emotions, a final attempt to manipulate the truth. For a brief moment, the entire restaurant held its breath. Donovan hesitated. Then, slowly, he looked down at the bowl of soup, then back at his wife. His silence was heavy, like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Elijah felt it. Donovan was standing at a crossroads. Either he believed his wife or he believed the truth he was starting to sense. Elijah had only one chance left. One final push to make Donovan see what he hadn't dared to admit. He took a deep breath. Then, in a voice that silenced the entire room, he said, "If you really trust her, then let her taste the soup." Celeste stopped laughing. The suffocating tension in the bistro was unbearable. It felt as though every single person in the room was holding their breath. The bowl of soup, once just another luxurious dish, was now the center of everything. A single bite. That was all it would take. Celeste maintained her confident exterior, her posture still poised, her face still perfect. But for those who paid attention, for those who knew how to read people, they saw the tiny cracks forming in her composure. And then, the front door swung open. 2 police officers entered, dressed in dark uniforms. They weren't in a hurry. They weren't making a scene, but their presence alone was enough to crush the air from the room. Celeste's face turned pale. One of the officers, a tall man with close-cropped hair and sharp eyes, scanned the crowd before speaking. "What's going on here?" His voice was calm, but it carried undeniable authority. Elijah didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, pointing directly at the untouched bowl of soup. "I saw her put something in this." A pause. Then, his next words came out firm, unshakable. "If it's poisoned, it will kill him." Whispers erupted. A wave of murmurs, gasps, and exchanged glances spread across the room. Celeste sat stiffly in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests, her knuckles white, but she still wore the mask, calm, collected, unbothered. Donovan turned to Elijah, then to the police, and then, finally, to his wife. He said nothing, but his gaze was thoughtful, calculating. He was rearranging the puzzle pieces in his mind. putting together every hesitation, every forced smile, every crack in Celeste's flawless demeanor. After a tense silence, he nodded. "Check it." The words were like a gunshot. The moment they left his lips, Celeste jumped up. Her chair screeched sharply against the marble floor. Her voice was no longer smooth, no longer dignified. "Don't touch it." It was too loud, too sudden, too desperate. All eyes snapped to her. And in that instant, she realized her mistake. A truly innocent person would have no reason to panic. She saw it on their faces. The slow, creeping realization. She saw it in the hushed whispers, the exchanged glances, the way even Donovan's expression had hardened into something unreadable. Celeste's throat tightened. She swallowed quickly, forcing a composed breath, lowering her voice. "I mean," she corrected, attempting to smooth over her reaction. Her voice dropped, softer, more controlled. "This is a private matter." She lifted her chin, her expression returning to icy elegance. "I don't need to endure this humiliation." But the police weren't easily manipulated. The tall officer stepped forward, his piercing gaze locking onto Celeste. He had seen too many cases like this before. Criminals always tried to maintain a calm exterior, but when pushed, when truly cornered, they couldn't hide their true nature. He exchanged a silent glance with his partner. Then, in a voice that left no room for argument, he said, "We need to take that soup for testing." A waiter stepped forward, holding a sealed evidence bag. The tension in the room was suffocating. And for the first time that night, Celeste Hayes had no way out. They couldn't hide their true nature. The tall officer glanced at his colleague, gave a subtle nod, and then moved toward Donovan's table. "We need to take this soup for testing." A waiter hurried over, carrying a sealable evidence bag, ready for the police to seize the bowl. Across the table, Celeste clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. But she couldn't do anything. A cold sense of helplessness crawled down her spine. For the first time that day, she felt it, the real possibility of losing. Elijah didn't look away. His sharp eyes stayed locked onto Celeste, watching every tiny shift in her expression. His father, Colonel James Brooks, had taught him something long ago. When you see an animal cornered, you'll see its true nature. And right now, Celeste Hayes was in the darkest corner of herself. She couldn't run, she couldn't deny, she couldn't manipulate. But Elijah also knew one thing. Someone like her would never give up easily. And he was right. Celeste bit her lip, her gaze flickering rapidly around the room. She needed an escape, a way out. And then, an idea flashed in her mind, her last strike, a desperate attempt to turn the tables. She spun toward Elijah, her face twisted with a deep, burning hatred. "Why does everyone believe a kid?" Her voice dripped with contempt, sharp and bitter. "Someone with nothing? Someone with no proof? He could be lying, a fraud, a troublemaker looking for attention or money." Gasps rippled through the crowd, more whispers. For the first time, some of the guests wavered again. Maybe she had a point, maybe the boy was mistaken. Maybe. Elijah didn't flinch. He stared her down. His voice was calm, steady, unshaken. "If you think I'm lying," he said, "then try the soup yourself." The words slammed into the bistro like a gunshot. The entire room froze. Eyes widened. Guests exchanged glances. And this time, Celeste had no response. The silence dragged on too long for her to come up with another excuse. She swallowed hard, but didn't touch the spoon. And that was all anyone needed to see. Donovan inhaled deeply, then slowly stood up. For the first time in their marriage, he looked at Celeste not as his wife, but as a stranger. His voice, once warm with affection, was now cold, devoid of any tenderness. "You just confessed." A heavy silence. Then, the click of handcuffs. The officer standing behind Celeste pulled out the restraints, his voice firm and unforgiving. "Celeste Hayes, you're under arrest for suspicion of attempted poisoning." Celeste froze, her face drained of color. No. Her voice cracked, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. She stepped back, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "I didn't do anything. I'm innocent." But this time, no one believed her. The pretense, the careful mask of elegance, the perfectly controlled demeanor, it had completely crumbled. And the bistro, once filled with elegant conversations and refined whispers, was now filled with only one sound. Celeste's scream. She was no longer the graceful woman in a luxurious red dress. She was no longer the untouchable socialite, the billionaire's perfect wife. She now looked like a cornered animal, her rage and panic mixing into every word she spat. All eyes were on her. But Celeste, so consumed by her unraveling reality, didn't care. She lost control. A police officer carefully picked up the bowl of soup, sealing it in the evidence bag. And then, Celeste snapped. She lunged forward, slamming her hand onto the table. The wine glass tipped over, red liquid spilling across the white tablecloth like blood. Her face was flushed, her eyes burning. "All right," she screamed. "I did it." The bistro exploded in shock. Gasps. Chairs scraping against the floor as guests instinctively pulled back. Some people covered their mouths, others turned white as ghosts. Whispers rushed like crashing waves, loud, panicked, disbelieving. Elijah barely registered the chaos. His ears rang, but his focus remained on her. Celeste's breath came in shaky bursts, her chest heaving. Her whole body trembled. But it wasn't from fear, it was from rage and hatred. She smiled bitterly, but there was no joy in it, only pure, seething resentment. Her eyes locked onto Donovan, cold, contemptuous. "Do you know how long I've put up with you, Donovan?" Her voice was no longer soft, no longer affectionate. It was raw, ugly, and for the first time completely unfiltered. She took a slow step forward. "For years," she hissed, "I had to play the role of the perfect wife, gentle, kind, loving." Her fingers curled into fists. "But in reality, I was just a prisoner, a bird in a golden cage. And she had wanted him dead for a long, long time. And now, she had nothing left to lose. A bird trapped in your golden cage." The words left Celeste's lips with pure venom, each syllable dripping with years of buried resentment. Across the table, Donovan felt his heart tighten. His voice, once strong, once confident, cracked under the weight of betrayal. "You really wanted to kill me?" Celeste threw her head back and laughed. But it wasn't the soft, elegant laughter of a billionaire's wife. It was the laugh of a madwoman. Unhinged. Unforgiving. "Not just wanted," she spat the words at him, her eyes burning with hatred. "I've been planning it for a long time." The room held its breath. Even the police officers, trained to handle the most unbelievable situations, stood motionless, as if they, too, couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Elijah clenched his fists. He had already known what she had done, but hearing her say it, admit it so easily, so coldly, chilled him to his core. There was no remorse in her voice, no guilt, not even a hint of regret. She didn't just want Donovan dead, she blamed him for making her want it. Celeste's gaze never wavered as she looked at her husband. "Do you know Donovan?" Her voice was almost conversational, as if she were discussing an investment gone bad. "I got tired of watching you sit on your massive pile of wealth, controlling everything, treating me like a decoration." She shook her head, her breath coming in quick gasps. "I waited. I was patient. I played the role of the perfect wife." Her lips curled into something bitter, something empty. "But you just wouldn't die." The weight of her words crushed the air from the room. The guests at Regency Bistro sat in stunned silence, as if they had all forgotten how to breathe. Even the murmurs, the endless whispers that had filled the restaurant minutes ago, vanished. It was as though the world had stopped. Because no one had ever expected to witness something like this. Celeste, flawless, admired, envied, had just confessed to murderous intent. And yet, she didn't look ashamed. She looked free, as if some unbearable weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She ran a hand through her dark hair, tossing it back as she turned to face the room. "Well, now you all know." Her voice was loud, bold, unapologetic. "Look at this. Look at the great Donovan Hayes, the man you've all admired for years." She gestured toward him with a mocking sweep of her hand. He didn't even realize his own wife wanted him dead. A deadly silence swallowed the room whole. Celeste stood tall, her head held high as if she had won. But then, a voice cut through the air like a blade. "Celeste Hayes, you are under arrest for attempted murder." The officer's voice was firm, emotionless. A verdict already decided. He stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. And for the first time that night, the confidence vanished from Celeste's face. Her smirk faltered, her posture stiffened, her eyes flickered just for a second with something dangerously close to fear. Then she took a step back. "No." Another step. "No, no, no." She shook her head violently, her breath turning ragged. "I can't be arrested." Her voice was no longer composed, no longer smooth. It was frantic, unraveling. "I can't." The police officer didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, grabbed her wrist, and snapped the cold metal cuffs around it. The sound echoed across the restaurant, the sound of finality. Celeste thrashed, her once poised figure jerked violently, her body trembling, not just with rage, but with absolute desperation. Her face, once controlled and unreadable, was now twisted. Her wide eyes were bloodshot, her breath shallow. It was over, and she knew it. "Let me go." Her scream was raw, her throat hoarse from the sheer force of it. She struggled, her chest heaving. "I can't be arrested. You can't do this to me." She kicked at the floor, pulling against the officers as they held her steady. Her hair was wild, her designer dress wrinkled and disheveled. The illusion of elegance had been ripped away, leaving behind nothing but a woman drowning in her own downfall. "I was supposed to have it all." She twisted, her voice cracking under the weight of her own fury. "This world was supposed to be mine." Her words echoed across the restaurant, desperate and delusional, but no one listened anymore. No one cared. Some guests gasped in shock. Others took cautious steps away, as if afraid of getting too close to the disaster unfolding before them. Eyes that once admired Celeste now stared in horror, because now, she was nothing more than a criminal grasping at the last shreds of power before she was dragged away. At the center of it all, Donovan sank into his chair. His body felt like it had been crushed under the weight of something enormous. His hands, once so steady, so strong, now trembled as they rested on the table. He said nothing. He showed no reaction. He simply sat there, his eyes locked on some distant, indiscernible point, as if searching for something, anything, that could make sense of the wreckage of his life. His mind blurred. Images of Celeste over the years flickered like a slow-motion film. The sweet words, the gentle smiles, the romantic evenings over wine. All of it. Lies. She had never loved him. She had never cared. The only thing she ever wanted was control, power, wealth. And when she could no longer manipulate him, when he started growing older, when he stopped being easy to control, she decided that he should die. The pain didn't come from the betrayal itself. It came from something far worse. He had never seen it before. He had spent his entire life mastering deals worth billions. He had outmaneuvered rival businessmen, crushed competitors, built an empire from nothing. And yet, he had been completely blind to the woman sleeping beside him for years. And that was a pain that no amount of wealth could ever fix. A man who had once stood at the top, who had built an empire from nothing, had allowed the person sleeping beside him for 7 years to deceive him like a fool. Donovan Hayes had lost everything in a single night. Elijah stood still, silently watching it all unfold. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't draw attention to himself. But inside him, there was no satisfaction in exposing a criminal, no pride in doing the right thing, just a strange, heavy emptiness. He had saved Donovan's life, but at the same time, he had witnessed a man completely fall apart. His gaze drifted back to Donovan, a man who, just moments ago, was a powerful billionaire, untouchable in his wealth and influence. Now he looked like someone who had lost everything that ever mattered. And in that moment, Elijah understood. There were wounds that would never heal. The police began to escort Celeste out, her hands cuffed, her body stiff with resistance. But she still didn't stop fighting. Her jaw clenched. Her knuckles turned white, her eyes burned with hatred. But beneath all of that, there was something else. For the first time in her life, Celeste Hayes was no longer in control of anything. And it terrified her. "Donovan," she hissed, her voice a mix of fury and desperation. Her fingers curled into fists as she dug her heels into the floor, fighting against the officer's grip. "Do you really think you'll get away from me that easily?" She let out a low, bitter laugh. "You think it's over here?" Her voice wavered, just slightly, not with anger, but with fear. For the first time, she was the powerless one. Donovan slowly lifted his gaze. His eyes were empty, as if he were looking at a complete stranger. And in truth, he was. He didn't answer her, because there was nothing left to say. But Celeste wasn't done. She struggled harder now, her voice rising into a furious scream. "You'll regret not dying, Donovan." Her cold gaze snapped toward Elijah. "And you." Her voice was dripping with venom now, sharp enough to cut. "You'll regret trusting that kid." Elijah didn't react, didn't move, didn't flinch, but he felt her hatred, knew that if she ever got the chance, she wouldn't hesitate to do the same to him, to anyone who got in her way. But this time she had no more chances. The police shoved her forward. The doors slammed shut behind her, and just like that, she was gone. The cafe was suddenly silent. A soft breeze swept through, carrying the distant hum of the city outside. It felt like the wind itself was trying to sweep away the remains of a story filled with lies, betrayal, and greed. Elijah exhaled slowly, glancing back at Donovan. The man hadn't moved. He still sat at the table, staring at nothing. Maybe in this moment he was wondering, was anything real, or was life just a carefully woven tapestry of lies wrapped around an empty core? Then, very slowly, Donovan turned to look at Elijah. For the first time, his gaze was no longer confused. No longer filled with anger or disbelief, it had softened. There was something new in it now. A strange mix of gratitude, exhaustion, and realization. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse, as if every word carried the weight of years of deceit. "You saved my life." Elijah swallowed, unsure of what to say. He hadn't done it for thanks. He hadn't done it for recognition. But deep down he knew one thing. No matter how hollow Donovan felt right now, no matter how long the pain would last, at least he was still alive. And from this moment forward, Donovan Hayes would never view the world the same way again. Even though Celeste was gone, the cafe still felt heavy with her presence. The whispers of the guests began to fade. Some stood up, quietly leaving. But the glances remained. They flicked back and forth between two people, the billionaire sitting motionless at his table, untouched meal still in front of him, and the 14-year-old boy standing across from him, the boy who had just changed the fate of everyone in that room. Donovan Hayes remained frozen, his whole body locked in a state of shock and exhaustion. The expensive Rolex on his wrist continued ticking, but time felt irrelevant now. Throughout his life, he had faced countless multi-million-dollar deals. He had gone head-to-head with the sharpest, most ruthless businessmen in the country. But never, not once, had he ever felt so brutally and cruelly deceived. Across from him, Elijah Brooks still stood, unmoving. He wasn't in a rush to leave. He wasn't expecting anything. He was just there. Finally, Donovan lifted his head. His gaze was different now, sharper, more focused, no longer lost, but filled with something that only those who had lived through too much could understand. When he spoke again, his voice was low, steady, not the voice of a man who was weak, but the voice of a man who had just woken up from a 7-year-long nightmare. "Do you know what you just did?" Elijah lowered his head, not out of embarrassment, but because he didn't know how to answer. He had never done anything in hopes of recognition. He had simply seen the truth, and he couldn't look the other way. His voice was calm but unshakable. "I just did what was right." Donovan paused. He had met many people in his life, people who only wanted something from him, people who sought his attention, his influence, his wealth, people who manipulated the truth to serve their own interests. But this boy, this 14-year-old kid who had nothing to gain, had stepped forward anyway, even though it could have meant no one believing him. Even though he could have been mocked, dismissed, or even put in danger. If Celeste hadn't been arrested, Elijah might have been the one in trouble. And yet, he had still spoken up. Donovan sighed, but this time it wasn't out of fatigue. It was out of something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Then he looked directly at Elijah, with a gaze full of respect. "You have a strong heart." A pause. Then, "I owe you my life." Elijah faltered for a moment. His eyes widened slightly. He had never expected someone like Donovan Hayes to say something like that to him. He didn't need the man's gratitude. He hadn't done this for a reward. But he knew one thing for sure. The words of a man like Donovan weren't empty words. Donovan took a slow, deep breath. Then he straightened his back. His demeanor shifted, gradually returning to that of a man who had once stood at the very top of the business world. His eyes still held pain, but now there was something different in them, something that had changed. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit down, Elijah." Elijah blinked. He hesitated for a second. Then, slowly, he pulled out a chair and sat across from Donovan. He didn't know what would happen next. But he felt that this moment was important. Donovan studied him for a long time. Then he placed his hands on the table, interlocking his fingers. His voice, when he spoke, was deep but measured. "Do you have parents?" Elijah nodded. "Yes. My father is James Brooks." Donovan raised an eyebrow. Colonel James Brooks? Elijah nodded again. A flicker of recognition passed through Donovan's face. Then, silence. For a few long seconds, he said nothing. But Elijah could see the gears turning in the man's mind. Donovan had heard the name before. James Brooks. One of the finest SEAL commanders, a man known for his discipline, loyalty, and integrity. And now, Donovan understood exactly why Elijah had such a strong heart. It wasn't surprising. Donovan smiled faintly, though his gaze remained thoughtful. "You're the son of a respectable man." Elijah didn't respond. He was proud of his father. But he also knew that his father wasn't the only reason he had chosen to act today. He had made the decision on his own, because it was the right thing to do. Donovan continued to watch him, as if he were trying to understand him completely. Then, very slowly, he spoke. "I want to help you, Elijah." Elijah blinked, surprised. "Help me?" Donovan nodded. His voice was unwavering. "You saved my life, no one can deny that." He sat back slightly. "And I'm not the kind of man who forgets a debt like that." Elijah sat completely still as Donovan continued. "I want to make sure you have a better future." His voice carried certainty, as if this wasn't just a simple offer, but a decision that had already been made. "Anything you need, scholarships, opportunities, connections, I can help you achieve it." Elijah didn't know how to respond. He hadn't expected this, hadn't even considered it. But looking into Donovan's eyes, he saw real sincerity. This wasn't a bribe. It wasn't a guilt-driven gesture. This was a man who had just witnessed something rare in his life. Unconditional courage. And he wanted to return it in the best way he could. Elijah thought about it for a long moment. Then slowly he replied, "I didn't do this to get anything in return." Donovan smiled, as if he had expected that response all along. Then he nodded and said something that Elijah would never forget. "That's exactly why I want to help you." Donovan leaned forward slightly, his gaze still sharp, but no longer tense. The last hour had been a whirlwind. He had walked into Regency Bistro as a wealthy, powerful man, enjoying lunch with his beautiful wife. And now, he was a man who had just barely escaped death. Now he was a man who had just woken up, to see his entire world for what it really was. Donovan had spent his life in a world of billion-dollar deals where everything revolved around profit, numbers, and power. He had built an empire from the ground up, calculated every risk and reward, outmaneuvered the most ruthless businessmen, but never, not once, had he owed anyone a debt as deeply meaningful as the one he now owed Elijah Brooks. A boy he had never met before today, a boy who had nothing to gain, and yet had saved his life. Elijah sat across from him, still trying to process what was happening. He hadn't done this to be rewarded. He certainly hadn't expected Donovan Hayes, a billionaire, to personally offer him help. And yet, here they were. Donovan reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen, a familiar gesture of someone used to making big decisions without hesitation. He dialed a number, then lifted the phone to his ear, all while still watching Elijah. A small, thoughtful smile played on his lips, but there was no mockery in it, just genuine determination. "I have a student you should meet," Donovan said into the phone. A pause. "This boy deserves the best future." Elijah's eyes widened. He sat up straighter, his hands clenching slightly in uncertainty. He had no idea who Donovan was speaking to, but something about the way he spoke, the effortless confidence in his tone, made Elijah realize that this was no ordinary call. Minutes passed. Elijah couldn't hear the full conversation, but he caught pieces of familiar names. A prestigious private school, one of the most exclusive in the city. A place he had never imagined himself stepping foot into. A place reserved for the wealthiest families, the children of politicians, CEOs, and elites. And yet, Donovan Hayes was speaking to the principal of that school about him. When the call ended, Donovan placed his phone down on the table. He folded his hands in front of him, his expression serious. "It's done." Elijah stared at him, confused. What do you mean?" Donovan leaned forward slightly. "I've just secured you a full scholarship." His voice was steady, matter of fact, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "If you accept, in just a few weeks, you'll be walking into an environment you probably never imagined possible." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. His mind struggled to catch up with the weight of those words. This was real. This was happening. But then, a small wave of hesitation crept in. "Why are you doing this?" Elijah asked, his voice quiet. His fingers clenched into the fabric of his jeans. I don't need this. Donovan smiled faintly, not surprised, as if he had already anticipated this response. You don't need it, he said, but you deserve it. Elijah bit his lip. He wasn't used to accepting help. He had always stood on his own 2 feet, always fought for everything he had. The idea of someone giving him something so life-changing felt unreal. Donovan saw the hesitation in his eyes. He had known many people who turned down opportunities out of fear. Fear that they weren't worthy. Fear that they didn't belong. But Elijah wasn't like those people. He wasn't afraid. He just didn't want to owe anyone anything. And that was exactly why Donovan wanted to help him even more. His voice was low, firm. Elijah, you did the right thing. A pause. Then, and sometimes when you do the right thing, the universe repays you in ways you never expect. Elijah sat still. His mind raced. He had expected nothing when he ran into that cafe today. Hadn't expected recognition. Hadn't expected help. Hadn't expected anything at all. But now he was being offered a chance to change his entire future. A chance that if he refused, he might regret forever. His voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say. Donovan smiled. His gaze still held that same sincerity. Then don't say anything. A small pause. Just take the opportunity. And finally, slowly, Elijah nodded. Donovan leaned back in his chair. He let out a slow breath, but it wasn't out of exhaustion. It was something else entirely. For so long, his life had been about making money, about building an empire, buying things that others couldn't afford. But this was something more meaningful than any profit he had ever made. Because he wasn't just helping a kid, he was investing in someone who truly deserved a future. And for the first time in many, many years, Donovan Hayes felt that he had done the right thing. Outside, the city stretched out beneath the quiet night. The golden glow of streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk. Elijah walked down the familiar street leading home. He had taken this same path 1,000 times before. But tonight, everything felt different. Even the air seemed to carry something new, a sense of change. And for the first time in his life, Elijah Brooks wasn't just walking home. He was walking toward a future he never imagined possible. Elijah walked home, each step carrying an invisible weight, not from fear, not from tension, but from a sense of change creeping into his life, an unshakable feeling that everything was different now. He took a deep breath as he stopped in front of the familiar door. The cool metal of the doorknob pressed against his palm as he turned it gently and pushed it open. Inside, the warm glow of the living room spread softly across the small, orderly home. Colonel James Brooks sat in his usual armchair, eyes fixed on the television screen as the evening news played. A middle-aged man with a powerful frame, straight-backed posture, and a sharp military-style haircut, James carried the discipline of a soldier in every movement. He had spent years on the battlefield, had seen war up close, had led men into dangerous missions. And because of that, his instincts were sharp. So the moment Elijah stepped through the door, James's eyes flicked up. He didn't ask anything, didn't demand an explanation. His gaze swept over his son, not with suspicion, but with assessment. A soldier reading the smallest shift in another soldier's face. Something was different about Elijah tonight. Elijah set his backpack down. He stood in front of his father, his expression serious, thoughtful. "Dad, I need to talk to you." James reached for the remote, turned off the television, and set it aside. Then, he gave his son his full attention. "What is it?" Elijah swallowed hard. Then he began to recount everything. From the moment he saw Celeste Hayes slip something into Donovan's soup, to the second he screamed for him to stop, to the tense, suffocating battle in the cafe, to the moment the police arrived, to Celeste's shocking confession, to Donovan's offer to change his life forever. James didn't interrupt. He simply listened. But as the story unfolded, Elijah saw the subtle shifts in his father's expression. A muscle tensed in James's jaw, his eyebrows furrowed. And when Elijah reached the part where he had to stand alone in front of all those powerful, skeptical people fighting against Celeste's manipulation, James's hands tightened on the armrest of his chair. His knuckles turned white. When Elijah finished speaking, the room fell into silence. He didn't know how his father would react. Would he be angry that his son had put himself in danger? Would he scold him for stepping into a situation that wasn't his responsibility? Or would he? James slowly nodded. His voice was low, but it carried the unmistakable weight of years of battlefield experience. Son, a pause. Then, you did something most adults wouldn't dare to do. Elijah blinked, surprised. James stood up, walking over to him. Then, with quiet certainty, he placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. His grip was steady, his eyes were filled with sincerity. I'm proud of you. Just 4 words. But to Elijah, they meant more than anything else in the world. A warmth spread through his chest. Not because he needed validation, not because he had doubted himself, but because the person he respected most, the person who had taught him honor and courage, believed he had done the right thing. James stepped away and walked toward the small liquor cabinet in the corner of the room. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but instead of drinking it right away, he gently swirled the liquid, his gaze distant. Do you know why what you did today was so important? Elijah thought for a moment, then shook his head. James took a slow breath. His voice carried a hint of nostalgia, as if remembering something from long ago. In the military, we don't always get to choose when we face evil. He turned, locking eyes with his son. Sometimes it comes when you least expect it, and if you don't act immediately. He paused, then said firmly, the opportunity may be gone forever. Elijah listened intently. His father's words weren't just lessons. They were truths carved from real experience. James's voice softened slightly, but the strength never left it. You didn't back down. You didn't let fear control you. A small nod, and that's what makes the difference between an ordinary person and someone who can change the world. Elijah felt the weight of those words settle into his bones. For most of the night, he had thought that his reaction in the cafe had been nothing more than instinct. A split-second decision. Something anyone would have done. But now he realized something. There were dozens of people in that cafe. Many had probably noticed something off about Celeste. They had seen her lean in just a little too carefully, had seen her reach into her bag, had seen her pour something into that soup. But none of them had spoken up, because they didn't want to get involved. Because they didn't want to risk their peace, because they didn't want to stand up for someone they didn't know. But Elijah had. And that's what made him different. James studied his son for a long moment. Then a small, knowing smile crossed his face. So, he said, what have you decided about Donovan Hayes' offer? Elijah pressed his lips together. For a moment, his gaze wavered. But then, he nodded. I'll take the opportunity. James raised an eyebrow, but he didn't look surprised, just proud. James nodded, his expression serious but approving. Good. Then, after a brief pause, he added something that caught Elijah by surprise. But remember, no one gives you anything without a reason. If you accept this opportunity, make sure you use it to create real value, not just for yourself, but for others as well. Elijah felt those words sink deep into his thoughts. He had been given a chance, the kind of chance that very few people ever get. But what mattered more than simply receiving it was what he would do with it. Outside the window, the city skyline remained still. But for Elijah, tonight marked the beginning of something new, a journey he had never imagined. And he knew one thing for sure: he would not waste this opportunity. On his first day at Stratford Academy, one of the most prestigious schools in the city, Elijah Brooks felt like he had stepped into a completely different world. From the cobblestone paths leading into the vast campus, to the towering Gothic-style buildings and the meticulously trimmed green lawns, everything about this place felt foreign to him. He had heard of Stratford Academy before, a school known for its students, children of successful entrepreneurs, politicians, and elite families. Here, students walked with a natural confidence, carrying designer bags, wearing luxury watches, and stepping carefully in polished leather shoes. This place was nothing like the public school Elijah had attended. He knew, without a doubt, that he was being watched. Not because of who he was, but because of what he had done. As he passed through the grand gates, he could feel the curious stares on him. He wasn't like the rest of the students here. But he also knew he didn't need to be, because he hadn't entered Stratford Academy through wealth or family status. He had entered through something no one could buy: courage. When Elijah sat down in his first class, he could hear whispers around him. Some students glanced at him, then quickly looked away. Not out of malice, but because his story had already spread like wildfire. Everyone knew. He was the boy who had saved billionaire Donovan Hayes' life. He was the one who had stood up in the middle of an upscale cafe and exposed an assassination attempt. Because of that, no one knew where to place him in their world. He wasn't a rich kid. He wasn't the child of a powerful figure. But he wasn't just a regular student either. He was something different. Elijah could feel the invisible pressure settling on him, but he didn't let it shake him. Instead, he recalled what his father had told him the night before. No one gives you anything without a reason. If you accept it, use it to create real value, not just for yourself, but for others as well. And so, as he sat there, surrounded by whispers, stares, and silent judgments, he reminded himself, this was just the beginning. That afternoon, Elijah sat alone in the school's expansive cafeteria. Everything around him felt unnaturally elegant. The long tables, the gold chandeliers, the students sitting in small elite groups. Then, a deep voice spoke from behind him. You're the kid who saved Hayes, right? Elijah looked up. Standing in front of him were 3 boys. The one who had spoken was tall, with neatly trimmed blonde hair and a perfectly pressed uniform. But there was something else about him. Something in the way he carried himself, a quiet arrogance. Elijah's eyes flicked to a small gold pin on his blazer, a student council member, a group that held unspoken power in this school. Elijah didn't answer right away. He simply set his plate down and stared directly at the boy. I'm not sure if that's a question. His voice was calm, steady, no trace of weakness. The blonde boy squinted at him. Then, he let out a low, sharp laugh. But it wasn't a friendly one. Who do you think you are? His tone was casual, but there was something undeniably sharp behind it. You think just because Hayes has your back, you can walk in here and be on equal footing with us? Elijah felt a flicker of discomfort rise inside him, but he didn't let it control him. Instead, he simply tilted his head. I didn't come here to be on equal footing with anyone. His voice was measured, unshaken. I came here to learn. The words were simple, but they carried weight. One of the boys standing behind the blonde student shifted slightly, almost like he was about to say something. Instead, he nudged the blonde boy as if reminding him to back off. But the blonde didn't move. Instead, his smirk deepened. And Elijah knew this wasn't over, not yet. The blonde boy's voice dropped lower, his words laced with something sharper than mere challenge. Jealousy. You might have fooled Hayes, but you can't fool me, he said, eyes narrowing. I can spot a schemer when I see one. Elijah didn't flinch, didn't react. He had heard those kinds of words before. There would always be people who couldn't believe that someone would do the right thing without expecting something in return. People who couldn't accept that a boy from an ordinary background could step into their world without scheming, without using someone, without playing a game. Elijah held the boy's gaze for a long moment. Then he calmly pushed his chair back and stood up. If you want to think that, that's your problem, not mine. And with that, he turned and walked away. Didn't look back, didn't need to. Because he had nothing to prove. Especially not to people who refused to see beyond their own selfishness and privilege. In the days that followed, Elijah gradually learned how to navigate Stratford Academy. He learned how to ignore the stares, how to focus on his own goals without being distracted by the whispers and rumors. Not everyone at school resented him. Some teachers admired him, not because of who had helped him, but because of his courage. Some students were curious about him. Some even respected him for who he was, rather than for the fact that Donovan Hayes had given him a scholarship. Still, Elijah understood. This was just the beginning of a long journey. He didn't know what lay ahead. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just proving that courage could change a person's fate. He was proving that one person could change the world if they dared to stand up and never back down. Meanwhile, Donovan Hayes began to see the world through a completely different lens. For years, he had believed that everything could be controlled through strategy, money, and power. But the events at Regency Bistro had shattered those beliefs. In just a few hours, he had nearly lost his life to the person he had trusted the most, and he had been saved by a 14-year-old boy he had never met before. The experience forced him to question everything. Donovan had spent decades building an empire, creating a real estate fortune worth billions. He had owned skyscrapers, luxury mansions, and cars most people could only dream of. And yet, none of that had protected him. None of that had saved him. It wasn't his money or status that had stopped him from being poisoned. It was a kid. Someone with nothing but his own moral compass and courage. And that realization changed him. People around Donovan began to notice the shift. For years, he had been a brutally practical businessman, a man known for being calculating, ruthless, and unshakable. He had been called a cunning fox, someone who put profit above everything else. Someone who never let emotions interfere with his decisions. But after that day, he was no longer the same man. He started to slow down and observe the people around him. Instead of judging his employees solely by their performance numbers, he started paying attention to their personal struggles. He noticed when one of his employees worked overtime to pay for his mother's medical bills. And instead of ignoring it, as he once would have, he quietly raised the man's salary. He began holding different kinds of meetings, not just business strategy sessions, but meetings where he actually listened to the people who worked for him. People began to talk about his transformation. No one really understood why, but Donovan did. Sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who change your life. 3 months after the cafe incident, Donovan called an emergency meeting with his company's top executives. The boardroom on the 50th floor of Hayes Enterprises Tower was filled with tension. Everyone knew that whenever Donovan Hayes called an unscheduled meeting, it meant something big was about to change. When Donovan entered the room, the murmurs died instantly. The executives sat up, waiting for him to speak. He took his seat at the head of the table, scanning the familiar faces of those who had helped him build his empire. Then, he finally spoke. "I've been thinking a lot recently." His voice was calm, but firm. "And I've realized that it's time for us to change." The executives exchanged skeptical glances. Change? Donovan Hayes was not a man who changed easily. He was known for his precision, his control, his ability to stay ahead in business. Now he was suddenly talking about change. One of the senior executives cleared his throat, speaking carefully. "Mr. Hayes, what kind of change are we talking about?" Donovan took a deep breath. Then he leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "I want to create a scholarship fund." Silence, confusion. The executives looked at each other, unsure if they had heard correctly. One of them hesitated before speaking. "You mean a charity program?" Donovan let out a small, knowing smile. "No." A pause. "I'm not talking about charity. I'm talking about an investment." He slid a folder onto the table. "I want to create opportunities for kids like Elijah Brooks, kids who are talented, intelligent, and brave, but don't have the means to succeed." A ripple of shock passed through the room. This was not the Donovan Hayes they had known for years. This was something entirely new. Donovan leaned back slightly. His gaze shifted across the room, landing on each of his top executives. Then with absolute certainty, he said, "We've spent our lives making money. But I don't want to leave this world without leaving something truly meaningful behind." A pause. "We can do more than just build wealth. We can change lives." Silence. Then, slowly, one by one, the executives nodded. For the first time in decades, they no longer saw Donovan Hayes as just a ruthless businessman. They saw a man who had truly changed, a man who had realized that sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the biggest impact. Top of form. Donovan Hayes had never been the kind of man to change his ways. He was a ruthless pragmatist, someone who believed in numbers, in strategy, in market forces, not in things like compassion. But this time, his board of executives could see it. He was serious. Donovan took a deep breath and met their gazes head-on. "I want to create a scholarship fund for talented students who can't afford it." The room fell into stunned silence. Then, after a few beats, one of the executives hesitantly spoke up, as if he was afraid he had misheard. "Mr. Hayes, are you talking about charity?" Donovan let out a small smile. But this time, it wasn't his usual sharp, businesslike smirk. It was a genuine smile. "No." A pause. "I'm not doing charity. I'm investing in the future." He placed a stack of documents on the table and pushed them forward. "I want us to create opportunities for kids like Elijah Brooks. Kids who are intelligent, driven, and courageous, but don't have access to the same privileges." His voice was steady. I want to make sure they have a path to success, even if they weren't born into wealthy families." The executives exchanged glances. They still didn't fully understand. This wasn't the Donovan Hayes they had known for years. Then Donovan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting slightly. Distant, thoughtful. "There was a boy who saved my life." His voice was quieter now, but it still carried weight, and he did it without expecting anything in return. He turned back to his team, locking eyes with them. His sharp, calculating stare now filled with something different: conviction. "I've spent my life doing business, building an empire." A pause. "But I don't want to leave this world without leaving something meaningful behind." His voice deepened. "We can do more than just make money. We can change the lives of those who deserve it." The room fell into complete silence. Then, one by one, the executives nodded. They no longer saw Donovan Hayes as just a cold, ruthless billionaire. They saw a man who had truly changed. Donovan knew. He couldn't rewrite the past, couldn't undo Vanessa's betrayal, couldn't take back the lost years of his life. But he could change the future. He could give kids like Elijah a chance they never would have had otherwise. And in doing so, he would build a legacy worth leaving behind. Time passed, but the story of Elijah Brooks and Donovan Hayes didn't fade into oblivion. It didn't just become an old headline. It became a symbol. A symbol of courage, a symbol of change, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected people can reshape the world. Elijah, once an ordinary boy, now had the opportunity of a lifetime. But more importantly, he had proven something greater than himself. Justice has no skin color. Courage has no rank. The Hayes Scholarship Fund wasn't just some casual donation. It became a revolutionary program. It didn't just help kids like Elijah. It created opportunities for children who had been overlooked. Kids with potential, but no means to chase their dreams. Kids who had once been dismissed because of their backgrounds. But now, they had a chance to stand on equal ground, to step into a world they had once believed was closed off to them forever. And yet, more than the money, the program, or the students it helped, the real change wasn't in numbers or statistics. It was in Donovan Hayes himself. For decades he had believed in wealth, status, power. Now he understood there are things money can't buy: kindness, integrity, courage. And it was Elijah Brooks, a 14-year-old kid from a middle-class family, who had shown him that. One afternoon, Elijah was invited to meet Donovan for the first time since their last conversation. The meeting was held in Donovan's private office on the top floor of Hayes Enterprises Tower, a space filled with large glass windows that overlooked the entire city. The clear sky reflected off the glass, creating a room that felt both imposing and expansive. But this time, when Elijah stepped inside, the man behind the large mahogany desk was no longer the cold, distant billionaire he had been before. When Donovan saw him, he smiled. A real smile, one without calculation or hesitation. "It's good to see you again, Elijah." Donovan leaned back slightly in his chair, his sharp gaze softening as he studied Elijah. "Have you gotten used to the new school?" His tone was calm, almost casual. Elijah nodded. "At first it felt strange, but now, I've adjusted." Donovan nodded in approval. For a moment, he said nothing, just looked at Elijah as if measuring the weight of his presence. Then his voice lowered slightly, as if about to say something important. "You know, Elijah, you've done something I never thought was possible." Elijah remained silent, waiting. "You've made me see the world differently." Elijah didn't know how to respond to that. What was there to say? Donovan Hayes was one of the most powerful men in the country. A man who had lived over 70 years, built a business empire, and accumulated more wealth than most people could imagine. And yet, a single moment, a single act, had changed him. Donovan's gaze drifted to the window, watching the streets below. "For most of my life, I believed power was the only thing that could change the world." A pause. Then he turned back to Elijah, his expression unreadable. "But you taught me something different." His next words sent a chill down Elijah's spine. "Justice has no skin color. Courage has no rank." Elijah had realized that long ago, but he had never expected someone like Donovan Hayes to say it out loud, not just as empty words, but as a truth he had come to understand. After a long silence, Donovan finally spoke again. "Thank you." Elijah's eyebrows furrowed slightly. Donovan held his gaze, his voice firm. "Not just because you saved my life, but because you reminded me of something I had forgotten." He exhaled deeply. That sometimes, even a small act can save a life. After the meeting, Elijah stepped out of Hayes Enterprises Tower and onto the bustling street below. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool air against his skin. In that moment, he realized something. He hadn't just changed his own life, he had changed someone else's. Someone who seemed to have everything, but lacked the most important thing: faith in the goodness of humanity. And no matter what the future held, no matter where life took him, he knew one thing: he would never forget this lesson. Because sometimes, a small act, a single moment of courage, could create a ripple effect that no one ever expected. The story of Elijah Brooks and Donovan Hayes did not fade into obscurity. It was not just remembered for the shocking assassination attempt. It was remembered because it proved something greater: that people can still trust one another, that one person can stand up and change the world. Elijah had entered the world of wealth and power, but he had never let that world define him. He was still Elijah Brooks, a boy from an ordinary family, a boy who had no prestigious background, no privileges like the other students at his school, but he had something else: courage. And that changed everything. Some stories end with a period, but some stories are only just beginning. The story of Elijah Brooks, of courage and justice, of change and compassion, would continue to resonate not just in his life but in the lives of anyone who is willing to stand up for what is right. The story of Elijah Brooks isn't just about a boy saving a billionaire. It's about something bigger: a symbol of courage, a reminder of integrity, an unyielding spirit against evil. It reminds us that sometimes even a small action can create great change, that justice has no skin color and courage has no rank, bottom of form.